Yeah, this is supposed to happen.
Yeah, wonderful.
Best sessions are in the bottom.
Of course.
Some of these are good shit.
What do you want me to do about it? Yeah, that's fine. Right, you're coming. All right.
Here.
Oh, it's still no, I wish I had one of those.
The other side of the street.
A little further than that.
So I'll introduce you individually right before you speak so people have a sense for it, even though we're very quickly. Yeah. I just started there this fall, so it's new skill. Just for 3 hours.
Once I was in a lady and got your
So you're smart enough to schedule all next week off? Do we cover? Or are you still working and planning?
Monday.
You might as well be a bride.
I know, it seems like it would be easy, but it isn't.
I might take Tuesday off.
Yeah.
You have to account for that.
Oh, I've learned my lesson.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. Please grab a seat, preferably in the front half of the auditorium. That would be great for our closing discussion, so we can really have a discussion. Thank you. I'm really grateful to Jennifer Greenhill for agreeing to moderate our final panel, which is going to be a roundtable discussion. I'll wait one more second. Thanks for trying to take a seat up front if possible.
And then like endocrine
Get papers, so don't worry.
All right, please come down and join us in the front. So I'm very pleased to welcome the moderator of our final panel, Jennifer Greenhill. She's Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Southern California. From 2007 to 2015, she taught at the University of Illinois in the Art History program and in the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory. Trained at Williams and Yale University, she specializes in 19th and early 20th century American art and visual culture with an emphasis on intermedial and intercultural objects, race and the politics of visuality, and the intersections between elite and popular forms of expression. In 2014, Greenhill served as the Terra Foundation for American Art visiting professor at INHA in Paris. She's the author of Playing It Straight, Art and Humor in the Gilded Age, co-editor of A Companion to American Art, as many of you have read, and her current book project, The Commercial Imagination, focuses on mass market illustration in the early 20th century. Please welcome Jennifer Greenhill.
Hi, everybody. So we all have a lot of energy for this last session, right? Everyone's ready to participate? Okay, so here's how it's going to go. I'm going to offer very brief introductions of our panelists, who will offer position papers, essentially, and they will then offer their positions, and we will convene up here with the chairs of the panels from the last 2 days and have a rousing discussion. Okay, so I have the honor of first introducing Johanne Lamoureux. Trying working on my accent. She's a professor in the Department of Art History and Film Studies at the University of Montreal. She's also currently in the very important position of the director of the Department of Studies and Research at the National Institute of Art History in Paris. Lamoureux has authored several books and articles on museum studies, for example, contemporary art and historiography. She has served as chief editor of the journal Intermédialité between 2007 and 2009, and has acted as a freelance curator at institutions such as the National Gallery of Canada. Her most recent research projects bring together museum curators and academics to investigate fresh uses of art museum collections, and this project is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So please help me to welcome Johanne.
Thank you, Jennifer. I will ask you to forgive my voice, and I would like to thank Amelia Gerlitz. You've been thanked for all aspects of the organization of this event. I would like to thank you for your patience with reluctant and reticent participant. And I would like also to thank the Terra Foundation and Veerle Thielemans particularly, because she knows how to make a philanthropic exercise seem like just a very stimulating intellectual conversation. You'll forgive the typo. That's what happened when one works between languages for too long. To the model of the web, the constellation, the network put forward on the Shifting Terrains programs, I bring a binary problem, or what will seem like one. A tale of two nations, or rather a tale of two empires. But is it a tale that I can, but it is a tale that I can only tell as a third party, formed and educated between French and American traditions of art history, and in a country that was torn between competing nationalism, Canada, beyond the wall. I will start with this invitation card I received just as Amelia was pressing me to send a text. It is the latest exhibition currently at the Louvre, and it's from a book by Jacques Attali called Une brève histoire de l'avenir, a brief history of the future. And I was surprised to see that the curators had chosen an American painting for the great fall exhibition of the Louvre. It is surprising because just in 2012, there was this big thing, this big hoo-ha, noticing the fact that American art was finally entering the Louvre, where from then on, 4 paintings would figure in the collection, 4 American paintings in the collection. So to realize that suddenly, Cole's The Course of Empire destruction was there to represent the future was quite interesting. Of course, the exhibition, when one went on site to visit the exhibits, you were told that Cole got the cyclical vision of history from Gibbon's history of decadence and the history of decline and fall of the Roman Empire, that it had influenced him. But when Cole's painting appeared on a French exhibition, to call attention on a French exhibition, you don't think of Gibbon, of course you think of Tocqueville. And Tocqueville, who's of Democracy in America, is the exact contemporary to Cole's painting in the late 30s. 1830s. And of course, Tocqueville is more interesting given the topic of the exhibition, because Tocqueville is the first one to have stressed that America was not the pure Edenic primordial past of Europe, but that it showed instead a clear image of where it was heading, that America was the future of Europe. So my question is, especially in the context where we have listened to Ethan Lasser's presentation, noticing the end of the American Gallery, where I've read in preparation John Davis' brilliant essay on the end of the American century, we might ask, is America still the future for France? Or isn't it France who, as a former bearer of universal values, that has now become the future of the United States as a kind of decentered, formal universal model? Isn't it France that is now showing the younger imperialist nation how to become a nation among other nations, just a nation among others? Quite a project. In such a context, the temptation can only be strong to declare the obsolescence of the game of nations altogether. Let's go transnational, now that the alternative is to be just a nation like any other. And it is problematic, since nationalism has shaped the narratives of art history almost everywhere, given the fact that art history was institutionalized in the very century of the rise of nation building empires. What is it to say on what we've witnessed today and yesterday? I think that the event per se did not really address the issue of transnationalism per se as something that has to be debated, and perhaps that's what we'll be doing in this session. But it has posited transnationalism as a program. This has been a programmatic event of what could be a way to reinvent the way of dealing with American history, art history. And in order to address transnationalism as a program, we have been shown what could be done, how other narratives are possible. Among these narratives, the narrative of material culture, to address the artifacts we all like to address and comment. On that, I have two remarks on what transnationalism could be and what this turn to the global could mean. The globe has to, and in there I would repeat what Jennifer Roberts mentioned in her opening presentation, the globe has to be seen as the ecological globe, the globe of ecology, and not the globe of economic globality and economic finance. And of course, we all think so, we will all agree with that, but if we look at the metaphors that have articulated our way of addressing transnationalism, exchange, transaction, you recognize an economic vocabulary. Of course, transnationalism is of the hour of the day, given the fact that if there's one privilege that nations have lost in the past century, it's that of controlling their currency, and which was generally the privilege of the king, the privilege of nation, and the currency is now what is determining the fluidity and the circulation of stocks and values around the globe. So we should focus on the planet as a globe and its material as a material thing, and not on the wire of satellites surrounding the globe and making all these transactions possible. That's one point. the other point is that given the fact that we were addressing the unframing and unbounding of American art history, of the history of art, of American art, space and spatial relations were everywhere. And I would like to just point that transnationalism cannot be elaborated as an option, as a viable option for making art history without computing a time factor. And that time factor has to take into account the dischronicity of narrative traditions throughout the world when time comes of telling a narrative of art history, of art making. As director of study and research at INHA, and in INHA the N stands for national, I encountered two situations. First, I was very grateful that the very first person to occupy the position had decided that one domain of research would be, and he did that like 12 years ago, would be a domain called Art et Mondialisation, so global art. So we have that. And I was surprised when I arrived to realize that in France, Art et Mondialisation very much means still post-colonialism, that France engages and has still not resolved the issue of rethinking its contact with the former colonies. To a point where I said as a joke when I arrived there as a Canadian observer, but you know, the world is not just what France once owned and has since lost. We have to expand our view of the world. But there is another vision. Art et Mondialisation is also very effective in buying books, making sure that the library keeps up to date with everything that is published elsewhere, and in welcoming young scholars from everywhere. And what I've been doing in the past year is receiving in my office dozens of young scholars with projects, and all these projects are national projects. They all come to me with the purpose of writing the history of female sculpture in Argentina in the 19th century, or writing the history of modernity in Colombia, or writing the modernity in prints in the 20s in Brazil. What do you tell them? Sorry, the nationalist framework has closed, and American art is now moving beyond nationalism, so let's all be transnational. You have to take into account that the validity of the nationalist project will have to be reinvented with people that still hold it dear. And when I ask these young scholars, oh, yes, you want to do that, why is it? Their answer is always the same. Well, actually, no, there are two answers, and the second one is a little more exciting for our purpose today. But most of them say, because it's never been done. It doesn't exist. I have nothing to deconstruct. I have nothing to move beyond. I have nothing to expand, to transfer. The narrative has not been written. And the other said, because I think that modernity in Brazil was already always global. And they tried explaining to you how so-and-so was in that country. And then you see the possibility that an interest for nationalist art history, or for national art history, I should say, will reinvent the temporality of what and when globality and globalism was born. In the very same way as postmodernism has rewritten modernity altogether. So globality is not just something now that should be stressing a new agenda, but something that should be put to use in the rewriting of national history, not just going beyond it before the time is proper, depending on where you live and what's the agenda there. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Claudia Mattos-Avolese, who is professor of art history at the University of Campinas in Sao Paulo, Brazil. She's also president of the Brazilian Committee of Art History and a member of the Comité International d'Histoire de l'Art. She holds a PhD from the Free University in Berlin and publishes primarily on 19th and 20th century Brazilian art and theory. She's currently preparing a book on art and ecology in Brazil and editing another on Brazilian art history for Getty Publications. Her latest essays include one for the Art Bulletin in October 2014, Geography, Art Theory, and New Perspectives for an Inclusive Art History, and in the French journal Perspective, Existe-t-il un art brésilien? She recently co-organized the conference New Worlds, Frontiers, Inclusion, Utopias, which took place in Rio de Janeiro in August. So please help me in welcoming Claudia.
I don't have slides.
Okay.
It's just me.
So shall we just keep this up?
Yeah, that looks beautiful. You can. I'm sorry for that. I should have invented something, but in fact, in the end, it's just about our field, and I couldn't imagine what kind of image to bring. But well, I'm super happy to be here. I want to thank Amelia and also Jennifer for thinking of my name for this panel. I think it's a super exciting panel. As you heard, I've been thrown into this discussion in the last maybe year and a half, been thinking quite a bit about it. I also want to thank the Terra Foundation for bringing me over, and Sam for receiving me here, and especially the Terra that has been very generous and is one of the institutions that, in my opinion, is really moving to a new position and has been a partner in various projects in Brazil, which has been really great. So I'm going to read my presentation here. It's a short comment on, I think, a more reflective general position regarding the field. And then I hope to have a lot of feedbacks from all of you. Okay. Last year, I was invited to take part together with various colleagues working on different universities across the world in the still oncoming discussion on With Her Art History promoted by the Art Bulletin. This was an extraordinary opportunity to think systematically about the state of the field in which we all work in, and more specifically about my own position within the map of art history. I say at the beginning, whoops, I have to be able to deal with my own computer. Okay, I say at the beginning of my article in the Art Bulletin that I believe that the editors approached me precisely because of my specific position as an art historian working in South America, but also with some circulation internationally. Apparently, a similar motivation inspired the present invitation, so once again, I will try to present here my personal view about the state of the field and future perspective, drawing remarks mainly from my own experience. You know, I'm moving into Mac, and it's a totally new world. It's crazy. So I think you have to use 2 fingers to make it go up, yeah. Okay. A general feeling of the art historical community is that the discipline is, for some time now, in crisis. There is an open mistrust in and determination to criticize and review the fundamental trends upon which the field was structured and operated since its founding in the 19th century. Following a shift experienced in the last few decades within the humanities as large, art historians have become more and more conscious of the power structures embedded in the organization of the field, as well as of their own political agencies, and are more willing to re-examine their theories and practices. This is therefore, in my opinion, a very important and positive crisis, although it is often dismissed, at least in Brazil very often, as a simple necessity of adapting art history to the trends of a global or a globalized world, a new globalized world. Within the new post-colonial and gendered frame of the discipline, old concepts such as the one of art itself, chronology, or national identities have been deeply revised. There is a desire to be inclusive and to expand the borders of the discipline beyond Western art traditions, for example, that has resulted in whole new objects of research and entirely different narratives. However, in my opinion, some central issues of the structure of the discipline still remain to be revised. In my view, there are two main problems directly related to each other which need to be tackled if we want to advance in the way we deal with theory and practice in art history today. The first one refers to the construction of narratives in art history, and the second issue is related to the distribution of power within the map of the discipline. As the field of art history began to expand in the direction of new objects and new geographical spaces, some important attempts were made to find methods that could be more embracing or more global, allowing art historians to operate efficiently in this expanded field. The discipline of anthropology has provided an important model for doing so, as we saw in Hans Belting's Bildanthropologie, for example, Anthropology of Image, I think is the name in English. And this is still going on, and you'll probably know that the last research theme at the Getty is art and anthropology as well. So it's been a big, a big thing, a big refreshing way of renewing art history. This, however, has provoked problems since it leads frequently to ignoring local specificities, local contexts, and local identities, as well as largely downplaying the role of history, in my opinion. Here, we also touch on one of the basic problems that we face in the process of developing a more critical art history. As we substitute concepts such as nationality with the idea of fluid borders and of a globalized world, we immediately understand that we fail to capture some of the complexity of the world. Also, in a globalized world, we continue to be local, of course, sometimes even more local than before, and that's exactly what maybe you were talking about in your presentation. What is actually really problematic about the concept of national identity or national art is the fact that these ideas rely on the idea of a monolithic identity within monolithic identity, which of course does not exist and reflects ideology and power above all. Large encompassing single narratives are the main problem here, in my view, and we have this tendency of looking for one new narrative when we deal with any of our issues. The field of human relations, as well as that of art, are constructed by the cohabitation of infinite voices that articulate multiple narratives, and we have to find ways to allow art history to reflect this reality and this complexity. To answer one of the questions posed by the organizers of the panel about the ability of national art today, I would definitely say that there should be no place for discourses on national art in art history today, but we should definitely take the tension between local and global seriously into account. In each construction, in each constellation we examine, referring to the structure of the field itself or framing our own interpretations, there will always be a combination of both local or more local and more global elements. And that balance always establish kind of a tenor that we have to take into account. We have to learn how to sustain this tension throughout to sustain this tension throughout and elaborate like more open and diverse narratives that will basically kind of coexist with each other. In this sense, I believe if we conceive of global art history as a project with one theory, one model, and one method, then we have a big problem. But such a colonizing project can be avoided if we learn how to deal with difference and how to embrace multiple narratives about art historical objects and practices. We have to realize that struggle over methodological approaches is a struggle over voice and power. And here we arrive to my second point, now the second issue, which is who holds exactly the power within our own discipline. As I argued before in my other publications, I really am convinced that the power struggle within the discipline today lies in the battle over theory and over method, and not so much on a hierarchy of art objects or art practices. In the last decade at least, I have never heard any colleague dismiss someone's talk by arguing that the object of the discourse did not belong to the field of art, for instance. Scholarly disagreements are generally about the way in which the topic was approached or examined. The big problem we see today is that although we are expanding the field of art history, the production of theory and method still lies in the hands of the so-called centers, and mainly, of course, in the US and Europe. We see this clearly when we start to examine the recent developments of art history departments in the US and in Europe. In the past few decades, many of these departments have opened up lines of research and teaching in non-European traditions such as African art, Latin American art, and Asian art. However, there is a strong tendency to hire scholars trained in the US or in Europe itself, for whom the main corpus of literature is English, in the case of the US, produced by their own peers, other American Africanists or Latin Americanists, and whose point of reference, I mean the place of the planet that they are studying, for instance, basically becomes kind of a space, a field, much more than a space of discussion and conversation. And there is very little contact to the local scholarly community. And this is very much true for Brazil and Brazilian, we should call Brazilian art history. There is today, actually in the country, a large community of art historians working within the country about topics not only related to Brazil, but related to art all over the world. But they also have like a significant institutional support inside the country. And there are also more and more international scholars, a big community of scholars that research on Brazil. However, the dialogue between these groups are really minimal. If we look into the bibliography of books produced about artists, Brazilian artists in the US, or so a Brazilian topic in the US, what you normally get is theoretical references from American scholars and archive material from Brazil, but hardly any reference to a Brazilian scholar working on the topic, and vice versa. The Brazilians do not really quote or cite the international scholarship as well. There is even a kind of tension or a power struggle to be felt. The reaction of the power to the power of legitimation within the discipline held by international scholars leads, in the case of Brazil, for instance, many times to either to a local nationalism, in the case of Brazil, very much, and I say in Latin America in general, and I think this is part of the why there's this tendency of looking for a specificity of like Brazilian art history or Latin American art history from our side. Or, on the other hand, it becomes a kind of neo-imperialistic discourse from the part of, international scholars. Both, of course, very highly anti-productive, in my view. Of course, the barriers are various. There is a language problem that we are seeing right now, partly. As also, but there is also like more profound questions as cultural differences, profound academic differences sometimes. And I experienced that, for instance, in publications in the US. Now it's very, very common that although like the content of some research is good, an international journal in the US will refuse it or will be very unhappy with it because of the way the research is presented. Now we have other culture of writing and not this American structure that in the end you end up learning, now that you have to say what you're going to say and then you say it and then you come back and resume it. So these differences also, I think, are impediments, like big problems that we have to deal with. However, the largest barrier is no doubt the unwillingness to open up to new modes of approach and interpretation, to leave the frame of what we could call an American or European scholarship, theoretically, and open up to hear the frame, the theoretical frame coming from colleagues that are positioned elsewhere. There is, in fact, a growing consciousness about the way power in art history is established. An important initiative, and important initiatives have occurred. I mentioned like what Terra is doing at this conference that I organized in Rio, for instance. The International Committee for Art History has also placed this question for some time now and is decided to make big efforts to become more democratic and less central regarding CIHA, and is actually making a big effort to take CIHA conferences to other countries that are not situated in this main stream of the field. Well, next year, the International Committee will organize the conference in China, and the next CIHA conference will probably occur 2019 in Italy, 2020 in Brazil. And, by the way, this new model of organizing CIHA in partnership, not only because up to now, I don't know how much you are all familiar with how it works, but normally they organize a conference every 4 years in one country. And we proposed a joint model where we will have a smaller conference in Italy, in Florence, and then a bigger conference in São Paulo. So this new model of collaboration is extremely important in setting new standards of cooperation, although this model is also very hard to implement, mainly because of financial issues. Now, it's really a lot of money involved, and CIHA doesn't give you the money, so you have to mobilize the finance the whole conference from a country that doesn't really have those resources most of the time. But we see that within this change in Siha particularly, and I had the privilege of taking part in the board discussions about China, so this is very evident. It's very, very hard to do this kind of transfer of responsibility and power. So during the meetings, there was always a question of what would happen because, would like the Chinese be trustful enough for making a kind of democratic selection, if they could in fact choose well, or if we would have to do that, like if someone of the board would have to be present in each of the sessions to be able to do this selection. And of course, there is like this anxiety in terms of what this means for the international community to just delegate to a country like China or Brazil or any other country outside where people actually don't really understand how the whole art history world works. What could be the result of this in terms of Siha and the international community? But on the whole, I should say there has been like a very a critical response within Siha, and they are working along. And in fact, we will have the next conference in China. The same principle of openness and tolerance of and difference should be put at work in smaller scales of collaboration. That is actually what I think could be our path. In a recent lecture at my university on Hélio Oiticica, one of the main characters of Brazilian neo-concrete movement, Irene Small, a scholar seated at Princeton, working on Brazil, commented that working on Brazilian material helped her to develop new narratives on modern contemporary art produced in general, not just because now the narratives would have to include figures like Oiticica or Elijah Clarke, but above all because their work called attention to issues at work in the practice of many US and European artists that actually hadn't been thematized yet. And she gave an example of that, talking about what she calls the organic line in Elijah Clarke's work, which is a very important issue for Elijah Clarke, and that from her work, she kind of saw it as a main element of modernity, and she is actually planning to write a book on this issue now. So in my Art Bulletin article in her article in Art Bulletin, Florina Capistrano-Baker writes that, and she's a Philippine scholar, for the Philippines, as in other parts of Southeastern Asia, the urgent challenge lies not so much in developing new theory as in retrieving and documenting art historical data from archives and objects before they are further lost through the looting of archaeological sites, the vandalizing of colonial churches to install baseball courts, the demolition of landmark buildings by misguided developers and politicians, or the collapse of 18th and 19th century architecture from the annual onslaught of earthquakes, tsunamis, and typhoons. I totally understand her point, of course, since the very same situation can be found in South America at large, as we all know. However, I also believe that this kind of opposition between theory and practice is one of the strongest and strangest arguments that sustains the power structure of the discipline in its split between an imaginary center and a periphery. We have to start considering theory from within the periphery if we want to be less imperialistic more democratic, and more inclusive. The very process of creating archives, of course, is not a theoretical process. It also demands active decision-making about questions of organization and selection that must be self-reflective. That is, that must involve, of course, some theoretical consideration. It is necessary, therefore, to have all these policies or politics in check in order to promote a more horizontal dialogue and to hope for a better art history in the future. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Paul Chaat Smith, who's a Comanche author, essayist, and curator who joined the National Museum of the American Indian in 2001. He's the co-author with Robert Warrior of Like a Hurricane, the Indian Movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee, and the author of Everything You Know About Indians Is Wrong. His curatorial projects include James Luna's Emmendatio at the 2005 Venice Biennale and Fritz Scholder, Indian Not Indian. So please welcome Paul.
Nice podium. Last night I had a dream about actor network theory. And in the dream I understood everything about actor network theory. But then I woke up. I'm not giving up on that. I first just want to congratulate the organizers of this conference for being a very successful 2 days. I've noticed we refer to this power trio that organized it by their first names. Sam, Terra, and Amelia. So they did a really nice job. So my institution, the National Museum of the American Indian, is intensely focused on ways to open new conversations about Native art, which for decades has been seen through a narrow ethnographic lens, or more recently as another minority group in multicultural America. We are interested in thinking about Native American art as part of American art history. And we also strategize about how to get our exhibits and shows into important journals like, for example, Art in America, and that's why we enthusiastically participate in conferences sponsored by Smithsonian's American Art Museum. People who are not art historians ask us why. Don't we have our hands full with Indian art history? Why should the country's biggest Indian museum be concerned with these questions? Leonardo DiCaprio in Christopher Nolan's 2010 film Inception explains why. Leo, as a character named Dom Cobb, says, once an idea has taken hold of the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate. To which American Indians say, no kidding. The idea about us that has taken hold of the global brain says that Indians are from the past. Indians are defined at their core as a people who may physically exist in the present, may even be around in the future, but they are shadows of the real Indians. The idea says that Indians can't truly be part of the modern world and also be truly Indian. And of course, that being Indian is practicing the culture of your ancestors from long ago. The more you do that, the more Indian you are. The less you do that, the less Indian you are. So who else has rules like this? Let's say after this conference you take a midnight flight to Cairo. When you land, you get a taxi and instruct the driver to take you to the Great Pyramids. If the driver is Egyptian, you might imagine that she's rather proud of the pyramids and feels some connection. You probably don't assume she has oral histories passed down through the generations about those days, or that she practices the same religion. Because we can distinguish that an Egyptian in 2015 is different than the pyramid builder Egyptians. Yet we think both are still Egyptian. So Indian art is at the center of that construction. Nothing is as popular at our museum as a show of 19th century Northern Plains material. And why not? It's fabulous. It's a high point of just not native art production, but an incredible achievement that stands up to the best art of all time. And lots of our visitors would prefer we show nothing else. Egyptians claiming the accomplishments of their distant ancestors as part of their heritage does not exclude or diminish their agency in the 21st century. I would argue that the opposite is the case for American Indians. The epic popular narrative is about vanishing, except for those few who desperately cling to the old ways. And yet our history shows a passionate interest in being part of the world in all its complexity and confusion. One can speak of great European art and reference in equal measure the treasures of ancient Rome and the genius of Picasso. Nobody gives demerits to Picasso because he doesn't dress or dance or make art like Da Vinci. Nobody says he's not European enough. So at the NMAI, we are, in our own earnest, cautious government employee ways, scheming to blow those ideas up. We reject the idea that we are mere shadows of our ancestors. We think we are just as badass in the 21st century as our ancestors were back in the day. It may be true, it may not, who knows, but the point here is we don't like being shadows. And the people who really, really hate being shadows the most are native artists. So Dom Cobb says these ideas that take hold in your brain are almost impossible to eradicate. Native artists say, well, bring it on. For example, James Luna. 10 years ago, the NMAI brought James Luna, the Lucenio performance artist, to the most famous art show in the world, the Venice Biennale. People ask me about controversy in my museum, and they expect to hear about canceled exhibits on genocide or something. But in my 14 years, nothing NMAI did or was alleged to be doing or not doing was more controversial than our Venice art projects. Many staff members, perhaps most, hated it. Mostly because they didn't get to go, I suppose. But also because, like most humans on Earth, they don't really care for modern and contemporary art. Also, it seemed like a junket, especially once the Washington Post decided to investigate. Here's what they discovered. It costs money to produce an art exhibit in the Venice Biennale. And this caused many to ask, why the hell is an Indian museum doing projects in Venice? We love that question, because for us it answered itself. The question is based on the assumption that Indian artists have no business crossing oceans to exhibit with other artists. Indian artists should stay home. Luna was perfect for that show, not just because he was the most influential artist to emerge since the 1980s in our field, but also because his most famous work, the artifact piece, consisted of him lying still inside a display case at the San Diego Museum of Man, surrounded by Lucenio historic materials. The piece rocked the native art world and called the question, can Native Americans ever be allowed to be modern? Can we escape the museum? Indian artists want to show their work in Venice for the same reason football players want to show their work at the Super Bowl, the same reason musicians want to play Carnegie Hall. They believe in their art, they want it to reach a large audience, and they are intensely interested in the art their peers around the world are creating. The show was a great success, even earning a mention in Art in America that compared it favorably to the official United States Pavilion. We showed that Native artists could hold their own with the best on the planet. We returned 2 years later in 2007. A seriously amazing work by Edgar Heap of Birds greeted the traveling biennial circus as they arrived at Marco Polo International Airport. Other Heap of Birds were scattered around Venice. I organized an artist talk with Edgar, with Lucy Lepard, the LA artist Sam Durant, and the UK video artist Steve McQueen. One afternoon after the event, McQueen sat down next to me on a park bench, and we had a long conversation about his future. It wasn't easy, but after an hour, I'd managed to convince him that he needed to start directing feature films for a mass audience. Okay, well, that's what should have happened. But instead, he sat down and almost immediately got up, sensing my burdens were too vast and too heavy I was giving out these vibes, and so we got up and left. Steve was probably right, because it didn't feel to me like we were getting anywhere. You'd get invited to the Peggy Guggenheim party, and days later realize all the cool people were at some other party, the name of which is painfully burned into your memory for years but is now faded. Art Forum, Hugo Boss, one of those. We could return year after year and never get the right invitations or manage to give the right career advice to art stars who don't need it. This is what Miles Davis must have felt like. You play sold-out gigs in London, Hamburg, Paris, Amsterdam, so you can tell America that Europe thinks jazz is fabulous, and America says, whatever, you guys have a nice time. Jazz and Indians are quintessentially American projects, things the country likes, but only on a conceptual basis, not so much in practice. Arguing for inclusion is a loser strategy. American Indian artists are not an oversight to be rectified. Inclusion is a boring word and a tedious project. More interesting is the idea that the United States is truly the unicorn in the family of nations, so radically absurd, so historically unlikely, so preposterous. No other country has ever been this rich, this powerful, so lethal, or so generous, and a source of so much hope and fury. What is it the Egyptians say? We're a nation, our neighbors are tribes with flags. As American art historians, I think we may not have fully come to terms with how weird and extraordinary our subject actually is. Every bad thing people say about America is mostly true, yet no popular culture is more popular than ours. Why is that? Christopher Hitchens wasn't lying when he wrote that the United States, for all its failings, is the last revolution standing. How can we understand American art without deeply investigating the mysteries of American national identity? The paradox that a third of the states, countless streets and rivers and cities, towns, weapon systems, sports teams, incessantly remind us every single day that Indians are central to living in America, and the equally insistent message that says, pay all this absolutely no mind. And when did all this transnational stuff start anyway? If all this isn't a problem that requires the most brilliant minds in our field, then I don't know what is. Thank you for listening.
Our last speaker is Veerle Thielemans, who is the European Academic Program Director at the Terra Foundation for American Art, where she oversees the Foundation's academic initiatives and partnerships in American art history, including international symposia, seminars in Europe, teaching and research projects, and many other things besides. Since 2001, she's been directing the Terra Summer Residency in Giverny, a 2-month research program for emerging artists and doctoral fellows in American art and visual culture, and many of us had the pleasure of being part of that crucial program. Born in Brussels, Thielemans completed a degree in art history at the University of Louvain to pursue further studies at the Outage in Paris, followed by a doctoral degree at Johns Hopkins University. So please help me to welcome Veerle.
I'm not used to this. I'm usually on the other side of the table, so bear with me. The task we have been assigned for this round table is to reflect on the possibilities of the field's overture to the outside and suggest some future directions, in particular the integration of American art history into art history as a whole, and vice versa, the engagement of art history as a whole with American art history. Having worked with the Terra Foundation for many years in Giverny and Paris, my remarks today will be directly inspired by that experience of facilitating, not really doing, but facilitating the study of American art in a location outside the US borders. These remarks come from further afield, as it were, from the terrain which has been made accessible by the shift to the transnational, from that position on the ground, European in my case, what can be said about his reconfigured landscape? So do 5, no, I'll just do this. I made it disappear. With the adaptation of a transnational framework, we have been able to witness many developments that have been benefited the field in various ways. A wider terrain is now covered, stretching to most, if not all, parts of the globe. New materials have surfaced, together with a more nuanced understanding of the forces by which those histories have been driven. Most visible, certainly, is the extended geographical reach of scholarly investigation, which has resulted in the change of nature of this art historical inquiry. Studies of these transnational networks address less what is American or what represents Americanness than how these connections came about and what they tell us about encounters between different cultures. The standard accounts of nation building and artistic formation that have for so long closed in the earlier histories of American art, they have been left behind. This embrace of a transnational perspective represents a major step forward towards a connected art history. By asking questions about intersections, crossings, even hostilities or conflicts between cultures, the field has entered into a dialogue with other art histories. Americanist scholarship is no longer the scholarly island it once was. But so much more remains to be done in order to truly tie it in with these other art histories, and that's what I will want to focus on. My first point concerns the proximity or lack thereof to the terrain or the territory that is opened by a transnational study. A study of objects, ideas, persons, institutions, and various other agents thus encountered. Paying attention to the term terrain, which was chosen as the emblem for this symposium, will help me to articulate this. A terrain is defined as a geographic area within which a certain set of characteristics has been identified. The term refers to, and this is a quote from a dictionary, a tract of land, especially as considered with reference to its natural features, military advantages, and so on. It can also refer to, another quote, a field of knowledge or interest which has been surveyed for a particular purpose, end of quote. Implied in this definition is a delimited or at least circumscribed area of study about which one has gathered expertise to be used for specific ends. It presupposes specialized knowledge acquired not by inhabiting but by observing the terrain from a distance, by abstracting elements that are not directly relevant to the purpose of inquiry, or so one supposes they are not. One moves over a terrain faster than those who are on the ground, and attachments are not the same. Most important is to be well equipped, but also to adapt one's equipment to the local terrain on which one is operating. Since the nature of the map one is drawing is dependent on the reading grid that is adopted to make sense of the retrieved information. Over the years, attending so many symposia and lectures organized or sponsored by the Terra Foundation, welcoming the curators involved in those exhibition projects, hosting our fellows at the Terra Summer Residency in Giverny, I have often been struck by the efficiency of their performances and their explorations. At the same time, I often noticed the temporary
and distant relationship they entertain with what they found on the ground. We are all familiar with the experience of dislocation. Translation is but one of the main concepts that have been advanced to think this problem through. Several Terra programs are trying to remedy the gap I am alluding to by offering research and teaching fellowships, travel allowances for curatorial convenings, to get to know the terrain better, delve into archives, spend time with local colleagues, and remain in contact after the travel is over. To overcome the distance that separates the art historian of American art from her object of study and the local context to which it belongs, she needs to have her foot more solidly on the ground, time to linger and be immersed. Showing you a slide of our summer program in Giverny, where we take the time, I think, in lots of confusing discussions. Another one which I think symbolizes this notion of immersion I'm pleading for. It goes without saying that the transformation of a survey terrain into a familiar base requires more than physical proximity or foreign language skills. Just as necessary is a better understanding of the local historical and cultural context in which visual objects or artists landed or circulated when traveling overseas. No doubt, a true transnational approach requires a lot of work to build up visual and literary knowledge outside of one's own field. It is not surprising that next year's international, oops, I forgot one. One disappeared, it doesn't really matter. Oops. I wanted to show you the slide of SIA, the conference in Beijing. Oh, you did see it. Okay. Where was it? Here. By drawing your attention to the notion of terms. It is aiming to enable comparisons between different viewpoints and methods. That's the program of the conference that also was referred to before. James Elkins had insisted on this point in his Art History as a Global Discipline from 2006, when the idea of a global art history was gaining traction. But arriving at a true polyglot art history, as John Davis pleaded for in his 2003 article on the state of research in American art history, it also implies a good grasp not only of the terms, but also of the intellectual traditions that have shaped other art histories. Social art history has been the prevailing tendency in North American scholarship over the last decades, although this is not necessarily the case in other countries. In France and Italy, for example, the majority of scholarship remains very close to factual art history. In Germany, art historians have built further on the traditional art historical methods as they emerged in German-speaking countries in the 19th and 20th centuries to propose an anthropologically inspired image theory. Looking at the relationship between art and science and technology, the research group centered around Renaissance specialist Horst Bredekamp, for instance, has played a major role in broadening art historical investigation to include the history of vision and the cognitive functions of the image. All of that one needs to know, I think. One needs to know better if one wants to do a true global art history. The discussions we have among the doctoral students from these various backgrounds in our Terra summer residency in Giverny often turn around these methodological and conceptual differences. Although it may seem a rather dry topic for a summer residency, methodology is indeed one of the most debated subjects among the fellows. Similarly to what has been said about about the necessary immersion in other fields than one's own, how can Americanists make their own terrain familiar to others, to outsiders? First of all, one has to be aware that what is well known for some remains foreign or of no interest to others. Americanists know the historiography of their own discipline very well, and I'm showing you yet another tentative to bring it all together. They are extremely aware of scholarly lineages and reflective about the state of their particular field. To non-US art historians, those historiographical landmarks within American art history remain for the most part completely alien. For instance, European students would have a hard time recognizing the existing linkages between the scholarships of Americanists who were trained at Yale University, which for you is also obvious. Even more important is the lack of familiarity with the artworks themselves, at least with regard to American art before 1950. There is very, very little historical American art to be seen overseas. A truly transnational American art history has to overcome such major obstacles. Such an endeavor necessitates, above all, access to art collections and research materials that are located physically on US ground. Access to resources really summarizes in a nutshell the entire mission of the Terra Foundation. Terra's partnership with the Smithsonian Institution, of which I show you here a slide, the digitalization of the American archives, is a capstone in this area, and it really makes a lot of difference for those who are not on US ground. Many people in the room would be surprised to see the conditions under which study and research are conducted at foreign universities. The delay in acquisitions of newly published materials in libraries, the limited opening hours, or even limited access to digital resources. You are also spoiled, and I really don't think you realize it. Although unlocking research is in itself not a warranty of quality, it is hugely important to arrive at the kind of communality that we have been talking about for 2 days now. My final remark has to do with what lies underneath the art history, the terrain of art history, always underneath. Art came of age during the 19th century, simultaneously with the rise of a national consciousness and the political formation of the nation state. At its base then lay the idea that a national artistic tradition is dependent on a set of national traits influenced by the factors of climate, social structures, and race. And also the belief in the transmission of these traits from one epoch to the next. We have stepped away from these premises, but the framework has remained. Studies in cultural transfer in the 1980s and 90s, despite their emphasis on exchange, were still operating in a national framework. For example, nationality formed the organizing principle of the 2009 volume Internationalizing the History of American Art, which was edited by Barbara Grosklaus and Jochen Veerle, with each of the essays being dedicated to a different national case study. To a large extent, a global art history does as well. While a transnational art history with its emphasis on mobility, exchange, conflict, has gained terrain over that of the sense of place, and routes have replaced center and periphery, the concept of a nation still forms the foundation of our discipline. The SAM Symposia series on the contact between the visual arts of North America and the rest of the world follows a national construct, albeit on a continental scale, and the Terra's own curatorial and academic initiatives, of which I show you 2 here, until today, build on a similar model. By crossing borders, concepts of nationality and nationhood are drawn back into the picture. Modifying the foundation on which a structure rests is not easy without the latter being heavily damaged or demolished. Art historians necessarily continue to be trained within a specific area of expertise, which continues to be most often defined in nationalist terms. But there are ways to avoid defaulting to nationhood as the organizing principle of our art historical edifice. The shift towards a thematic that we are witnessing in this conference, the things session, the transaction session, any of the four sessions actually, promises to make these national categories less thick. The Terra Foundation essays, of which the first volume will be coming out in early 2016, shares this reorientation towards the thematic, grouping essays on American art by topics of interest to art history more broadly. And I think the next move would be that we would not devote those essays solely to American art materials, but bring comparative materials in as well. American art history explicitly needs to engage and inscribe itself in questions that animate the larger community of art historians, to set works of art by US artists, in particular those predating World War II, side by side with others in exhibitions that tackle all sorts of themes. This is the one that Johanne referred to, and I especially like the fact that the coal banner is being cut, the picture is being cut. So set side by side works in a thematic way, write essays for non-Americanist anthologies and journals. You have to start to engage in inquiries outside of your own field. That would be my main message. Find a common ground of interest. A common ground, quotation, an agreed basis accepted by both or all parties for identifying issues in an argument. More than surveying new terrain, this is perhaps what we have to work towards if we want American art history to be part of today's and tomorrow's critical practice.
So John, you have to come back. Okay, so if we can get the speakers to come back up, and also the chairs of the sessions over the last 2 days, that would be great. We're going to bring some more chairs out for you. So I have a million questions, but I'm just going to limit myself to one, and then we're going to open it up. And I had a different question planned, but I thought we'd start very practically, since we've talked about the restrictions of operating in certain institutional, disciplinary, even cultural frameworks, the limitations involved in those situations, the misunderstandings that are produced from those situations. And it seems to me, at least, that the transnational is being offered as a potential solution to those problems, but it's also the structural condition that produces the misunderstandings. So I wondered if there's a way for us to think practically, which I think will connect back to theoretical and conceptual issues and how we're framing what we're doing, if there are practical ways in which you would propose, this is really Amelia's question, going forward collaboratively. I have my own ideas, but I wondered if you wanted to just address that. All right. Do you think, oh, okay, yes. John.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on something that I think is inherent in your question, is the idea that we should somehow overcome these misunderstandings, or we should be searching for a situation in which there's this harmonious.
I'm not
okay, good.
overcome that at all, but
yeah,
maybe there's a way to creatively use the misunderstanding
right.
as we move forward.
Yeah, and I mean, just following up on what Jacqueline Francis said, yesterday about the sense that maybe critical race art history now has to be it will be strongest when it's in a state of constant failure or near failure, where we're comfortable with discomfort. And I think that's something that is difficult for academics to do. And as you say, I thought your point about the terrain was outstanding. It's not, you don't want to be in a state of discomfort when you're surveying the terrain. It's all about mastery. And I would just say that I think it's important that we give up on the idea of mastery, just set it aside, because it's totally impossible in this kind of an environment, and that we have to be able to put aside our need to control our expertise and be open to misunderstandings at every level, so that we should be seeking them out.
So there is something, though, that came up about in the comments earlier that I think address your question, Jenny, which is the question of what scholarly standards are in a global context. And I actually want to really disagree strongly with the idea that there are, 30 kinds of standards. There are habits and cultures that are local, but scientists work in a universal way with what scientific method is, and they communicate internationally all the time. The kinds of things that we're talking about as these amazing barriers and obstacles really don't come up as much in the world of science. And I think, you could say, well, that's because they're naive and they're, think they have a universal discourse. But I would say for the mission of something transnational or global, having that attitude actually probably works better than ours. The idea that we can't possibly understand each other, that things are really, really different. It's, everyone who's traveled knows you go to France, the conference will begin, 15 minutes late. In Germany, it will begin on time. But you'll get a hot lunch there and a cold lunch there. I mean, there are differences, some of which matter to some of us enormously, but I actually believe that we have to take seriously the idea that we have an international community, that there is a history, which means certain places are the leaders of that international discourse, and that people from outside of those places have always improved those discourses. Whether it's people who are American but really aren't from here, whether it's people in France who are really Jews who made the great social sciences, Durkheim, whatever. We think of them as, Mauss, we think of them as French, but we really know that, one generation ago they weren't. They were in that conversation, they advanced that conversation. We didn't say Mauss couldn't possibly contribute to the history of the social sciences, he's from somewhere else. And I think it's really important for us, if we want to join this project, to do that. And then the last thing I want to say on this kind of hopeful belief that we can actually communicate and share is the idea that people can master other cultures. They don't ever inhabit it like the people who are from those cultures. But anyone can be an Americanist. I'm proof of that, by which I mean, I set out, and my career began as someone studying France. And I spent my time talking to French people and, studying their culture. And it never dawned on me that I couldn't be a scholar of France, ever. Ever. And it is strange to me when I see scholars from outside the United States act as if they couldn't be scholars of the United States. And that is something that we Americans have to give up the idea that we only really understand America. But it does mean that people not from the United States have to spend time here, which is why funding from Terra and SAM is so important. It isn't just to put it on the internet. You have to be in this place. You have to learn actually the language and the culture and become familiar and be a kind of person who's of multiple cultures. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. But there is a long way to go. I mean, there is a long way to go. Coming here, studying here takes a lot of effort, a lot of financial opportunity. So it all depends what kind of timeline you have in your head. And some of us are the lucky ones, but there are many others who are not.
Well, I actually want to talk from concrete experience that I have been having now with the editing of this book for the Getty on Brazil art history, which is a very, very enlightening thing that we are doing, because basically half of the scholars, they are all Brazilianists, half coming from the US and the other half from Brazil. Yeah. And, you know, I kind of disagree with this comparison with the natural sciences, or like hard sciences, whatever you want to call it, because we have humanities in general, obviously, you know, constructs discourse and builds narratives in a totally different way as this happens in science. And because in science, I mean, there is one main discourse. When that discourse changes, in general, it is accepted when the whole community turns into that new perspective. And that is absolutely not what happens in the humanities, and absolutely not what we want, because we actually want diversity and difference, and that's where we we are basically dealing with the same things. And what is interesting is that we can see this from absolutely different perspectives and convince each other that, you know, yeah, this can be seen like this and the other one like that, and we have to deal with that. So I think it's a totally different reality. And what I think is really important is to have, you know, to really consider that, of course, if you are seated, it's not a question of country, it's a question of local tradition, as you said. And if you are seated in a specific place, you create a specific theory that obviously dialogues with other theories. No one can, of course, there is obviously the main structure is American European, and that is where the theory is really happening. But there are like developments and perspectives that happen, and I think the only way that we can like really produce something different and produce this interesting change that we need is actually letting these people talk about the way they deal with with this object. You know, it's not just a matter of, oh yeah, what you're studying, which object, but how you approach it. And I think this is not really done, because and this is my experience, if you, as I said, if you want to publish in an American journal, there is a pattern and there is a way, and there are things that you know will be published, and things that you're absolutely sure that will not be published, because there's a specific culture, a specific interest, a specific way to do it. And I think this is, obviously, it is what it is, but it is something we have to be very conscious of, to try to somehow subvert and change and open space for different cultures, or for this tension. I think we're not harmonizing anything. We want more tension. We want more confrontation, and we don't have that, you know. Like, if I want to write about Brazilian art history and publish it in the US, it has to be in this format. There is no way out, you know. That is how it is at the Getty publication as well, you know. And so what we are like dealing with in the book, coming back to my concrete example, is that I have to come to my Brazilian colleagues and say, well, you know, the referee said you didn't do like the introduction saying what you're going to do. You started with a beautiful poem, you know, and a very beautiful, like, poetic introduction, but no one knows what you're going to talk until you talk. So that is not acceptable. You know, these kinds of... So I think it's a pity, because in a book like that, we should be able to have both ways of writing somehow, you know. We have to have more tolerance and learn and be more flexible. That is basically the...
So if that's a symptom of a kind of misunderstanding, then it's restrictive. And I would say that many of us, especially Americans going abroad, we have the luxury of inhabiting that space of misunderstanding while still potentially retaining the power that we have over this field of American art, because if you want to publish in an American journal, it's true. I mean, I've experienced this on all of these committees. We get submissions from scholars outside the US, and maybe their way of writing is different, and so we don't quite know what to do with that. So that is actually a real problem that we do have to contend with. Yeah.
Although that's,
No, I was just going to say that, there are, I think, it's worth holding on to the distinct advantages of working on American stuff from outside America. At the point I started to think that I might want to work on American art, I had no idea of the terrain into which I was entering, and I think that is possibly freeing and productive. And in a basement in a library in Australia, reading Fortune magazine, because Fortune magazine was what that library had, not Life magazine. So I was like, that'll do. That seems like a good place as any to start. And of course, in entirely unanticipated ways, that very much shaped my work. And I think in all sorts of ways, the kinds of access that you get on the periphery, if we are allowed to use that term anymore, can produce restrictions that require creative solutions that are different to the ones that those in the centre might come up with. So it's not always a story of disadvantage. There's something possibly freeing about being apart.
So do we want to, I'm sure you have questions. Maybe we can open it up now if people would like to. Yeah, or comments could be.
Okay. So both Claudia and Jennifer Roberts brought up most explicitly, but I think it's come up in different ways, calling for this need for theoretical frameworks and methods from the periphery, from the margins. And I'm wondering if maybe we can have a reading list? I mean, like, who would you look to as a possible source for a different kind of epistemology or way of approaching a history of American art that's not so American, right?
Can I just... well, I think I can just give like one example in anthropology. Because I just started to, read and be a little interested in network theory as well as, something that ends up coming. And the funny thing is that Latour actually, in great parts from this, from Brazilian anthropology and a kind of a specific, I call it Brazilian anthropology, but Viveiro de Castros, who is a main researcher of Brazilian native cultures and studying their perspective on the world and their discourse, the native Brazilian native population that he studies in the Amazon, presents these theories of the world that actually ended up, calling Latour's attention and transforming, his discourse or our discourse in a big measure. So I think this is the most, amazing example that that comes to my mind, how, just to listening to this indigenous theory, how they conceive the world, how they understand the relation between man and animal and man and the world, transformed entirely. Of course, it's a specific moment in our tragic history of, destruction of the planet and ecology and all that opened space for this, but this contact between peripheric, maybe, theory that we could call it, And the transformation of a main field is something that really can happen. And I think this is just one. Probably there are many examples. Huh?
I would just add that for me, one of the ways that I've found myself most conscious of the Americanness of my theoretical background, and also have been able to see ways around it, has been through teaching, and particularly teaching this class that I mentioned in my introduction, which is, I've been teaching it for 10 years, it's called The Thing. It's not about American material culture, so it's taken by graduate students throughout the department. And what I've often tried to do is encourage students in the Asian fields, for example, or in African art to take this class. So I'm teaching a pretty profoundly cross-field seminar. And it's a very difficult seminar to teach because I'm basically having to grade papers on Chinese ink painting, which I feel a little uncomfortable about. But each of the students will write papers about reading something in their own field through this body of theoretical knowledge. The theoretical knowledge itself is destabilizing because so much of it is coming out of disciplines that don't organize themselves around nation states the way that we do. I mean, like anthropology and philosophy don't have the same kind of national organization. So you're forced to confront a body of thinking that is organized in a totally different way. But it has been incredibly instructive for me to talk to students of Chinese art who are coming to this Western approach to thingness and objecthood from a totally different tradition, very highly developed and sophisticated tradition of thinking about objects, one that because of many, many barriers, both disciplinary and language barriers, really hasn't been able to be in conversation with the Western nervousness about materiality. But I think that would be one way of pushing ourselves into other fields without having to necessarily always to get on a plane and go to another country, is to try to find ways to bring students who are not Americanists into your classes. And I don't know, I wanted to ask Veerle a little bit about whether the Terra has thought about how to create more international populations of students in university seminar situations. So not bringing them to Giverny or to the Smithsonian, but how can we encourage more students from Japan to come and study in American universities? How can we make that easier? Because it's in those seminar rooms where these powerful theoretical models are being built, and that where these norms are established about academic behavior. But that's still so. Those rooms are controlled by individual departments looking at their applications and deciding who's getting in and who isn't. And the Terra is not helping us with that.
It's something that also European universities request, or professors request, that we start some of the best students. Or don't you have how do you call it, a study stipend, or to enroll at the university? And we are thinking of it, but it is expensive. And our strategy so far has been to really pilot the professors, the American professors, and bring those over, because that's one individual, but you get a lot of students in the classroom. That's a program we have with Johanne at the NHR. Jenny was part of it. But I personally also think that it does something to the American being piloted in that new context. So we in a way, when Jenny came back to her own professional environment, I think that kind of experience then filtered through to her own students. But it would be fabulous if we could give more opportunities to European students to come and study. So we'll see.
Hi, I had a question about periodization. So as a doctoral student working on an 18th century project, I noticed that most of the talks over the past 2 days were actually grounded in the 20th century. And I think in terms of having a conversation about how this transnational perspective is shifting the field of American art, many of those lessons I think are broadly applicable, but I've also had interesting conversations with colleagues over the course of the conference about issues that are very different depending on whether you're looking at the 18th or 19th century, both within those disciplines but also within the circumstances of those periods. And I would love to hear members of the panel just sort of talk broadly about the these different topographies that might arise from studying American art from different time periods, as well as sort of the broader lessons that we can apply across the breadth of American art.
Could I just ask her a follow-up question? Can you imagine, I'm just thinking about Vanessa's proposal earlier today, that we perhaps consider doing away with the American art history framework and think about becoming period specialists? So I wondered just if you have a sense of that before we pass it along.
Actually, part of my question comes out of, we had a Terra seminar with Tim Berenger last month where that was a primary topic of conversation, is having scholars of, the Atlantic or scholars of the 18th century broadly. And I think that is interesting to kind of think about as another sort of global approach with its opportunities and pitfalls that can kind of exist alongside the conversation we've been having this weekend about this transnational global American art history. So thank you.
I think we do that already, and what's interesting is how art historians aren't so present at those associations. There's ASICS, the Association for 18th Century Study. There's 19th century studies. There's a 20th century studies. We have these associations, and I've gone to almost all of them. And what's really interesting to me is how few art historians go to their own conferences and therefore stay in the way they've organized their fields. And so I think if art historians just went, if you work on the 18th century and you start to go to ASICS, I think you would already be, in a sense, doing that because these communities do pre-exist. And I think, as someone who was really interested in the 19th century originally and kind of worked in Europe, but then got interested in America because of the rich work being done on 19th century vernacular visual culture in the United States, I just kind of had to follow the work. But there were people out there. It wasn't so difficult. So I think, now not everyone, and I think this is where you've got a problem, not everyone wants to stay in one time, right? So the problem is how do you, create a professional identity? Some people stay in the, 50 years and some want to travel. And if you travel, then do you travel across the ocean, stay in the ocean? This becomes the question. And I think what people can do is continue to frame questions in interesting and productive ways and find those fields and define and redefine those fields. So I think for some people, period, for medievalists, it's always period. It doesn't matter whether you're in an English department or an art history department. The art historians who are medievalists go to medieval studies. That I assure you. So I think we should be thinking of ourselves, where are we blind or where are we kind of narrow and cantonné, because some fields, even in art history, are very, as it were, period defined.
Can I just say something about Essex? Because I actually went several times to the 18th century community. And it's ideally a very nice thing, but it's a gigantic event and basically composed by super specialists because the sessions are like dresses in, London in the 18th century, so you go through it's great, but in the end, you're like inside, you're super, and the you know what I mean? The period is even one more like closing off of whatever you already are a specialist in. So I don't know. I think the concept is wonderful, but it really is not a place where I always met the same people because, I was dealing with 18th century in Italy and so there were always like the same people there. And
the 2 or 3 times I went.
Yeah,
so.
there is also a difference between, I think, interdisciplinarity, which is what you are alluding to, and then sitting around the table with art historians of different specialties. And interdisciplinarity, I think we've all learned to value it, at least since 30 years or so. We practice it badly because it's extremely difficult to do and it needs a lot of expertise. But we don't sit around the table as art historians so often, except for the very contemporary. I think we need to talk about the difference between pre-1945 and after. Voilà, I just wanted to throw that in because many of the seminars have that kind of interdisciplinary aspect.
I would say, can I just add that, I think this is a really valid question, and it's symptomatic of the questions that have been before us this weekend, because there are people who consider themselves 19th century art historians, but they're usually Europeanists. And one question would be, if there is a job available at a major university in 19th century Western art, would an Americanist ever get that job? Probably not. I think we're still in a situation where Americanists in these major periodization fields within modern art, Western art history, are still considered to be provincial, secondary, weird. So I would love to see people in our field be able to move into this kind of strictly periodizing, these periodized possibilities, but I still think it's difficult to do. And I think, following up on Veerle's point, it can only come when our work is speaking to other people working in the 19th century, not on American art, and that we can begin to have a kind of methodological legitimacy, even in our closest, most cognate fields like European, like French 19th century painting. So we don't all want to be periodized necessarily. I would be really upset if I could only stay in one century, but it's also a mode it's something that we need to be flexible enough to be able to do. And the discipline isn't there yet, I don't think.
I have a follow-up question.
Someone could get that job who also did French photography. In other words, it's even worse than you say. So I think we, quite seriously, in other words, if you don't advertise for the history of photography, could you just hire someone in 19th century or 20th century modern and contemporary art who did photo? Forget your country. So, I think this is an even more difficult problem about what figures. And as someone who hired someone in modern and contemporary who was an Americanist, I can tell you that, times are changing.
I have a follow-up question. It's over here. Okay. Thank you. I have a follow-up question which relates to periodization, to do with the turn in recent years to hires that are in modern and contemporary fields but include the word American in them. So hires for an American modernist. There was last year a job which was for an American modernist, and the requirements were that the PhD be in American or modern, which I think reflects this kind of awkward position that we're in. But what I wanted to hear anyone reflect on who's interested in is just the way that in a way that seems to be a kind of opposite direction than what we've been talking about over the past 2 days, and that it's an assertion of a national framework where previously, in terms of the way the discipline has been divided, there has not been one. I understand that that's also, in a way, an expansion of a historical or chronological one, an assertion that, of course, there is American modern art, American contemporary art, but I'm wondering how this global or transnational turn that we've been talking about relates to that other shift that you see in the ways that jobs are being positioned, in the ways that people have to think of themselves who may work on post-war or contemporary American art.
I have one thought. As someone who only has a job for another 2 years, this is probably an outlandish thing to say, but I think the worst thing for the field could be a scholarly framework that emerged from the categorizations of university administration. that to me seems like not at all what the history of art calls for. Yeah. It feels like something that actually should be actively resisted. And if there are ways that, as scholars, that can be grappled with and incorporated, and that we can have ways of thinking about our work that fits those parameters and yet isn't defined by them, I would hope that that could be a way forward.
I'm being signaled that we are wrapping it up. So I'll invite you all to continue this conversation. We are meeting in the Luce Center, which is a fantastic space. I think there are drinks. There might be food. Okay, there's food too. So you do have to cross the courtyard, and there will be people directing you. So please come over there and continue to pump our speakers for further answers.